350 years ago, there was a woman venerated as a saint in Mexico. Her name was Catarina de San Juan, and she died in Puebla in 1688. But she wasn't born in Mexico. She wasn't even born in Spain. She was born in India. How did a woman from the Malabar coast end up in a Jesuit convent on the other side of the world? Today, we're talking about the first Asians in North America with Dr. Diego Javier Luis. This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. Our guest today is Diego Javier Luis, Assistant Professor of History at Tufts University, and he's the author of the new book, The First Asians in the Americas, A Trans-Pacific History. Thank you for joining us, Diego.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so just as a first question here, as a primer for our audience, can you just tell a brief introduction to your book and what it's about?
Yeah, so the book, The First Asians in the Americas, as the title very strongly suggests, is about that earliest movement of Asian peoples who are both free and enslaved, who are crossing the Pacific in Spanish ships from 1565 to 1815, primarily from the Philippines to this small port on the Pacific coast of Mexico called Acapulco. And so the book follows these people's lives as they're transitioning through distinct geographies of empire and really tries to uncover what their lived experiences were like in colonial society in the Americas. And so it follows them into central Mexico, but also south to Guatemala and to Peru. And then you even have some people who cross Mexico, board ships in Veracruz, and then sail across the Atlantic and end up in Spain. So it's really an expansive scope, but at the same time, I'm very concerned with the level of lived experience to keep it grounded in real people's lives and the problems they faced and what they overcame, and et cetera, et cetera.
So another really important thing I want to speak about immediately is the terminology, because you have a little note at the beginning of your book about terminology. And I know from my studies in the Atlantic world that it's very important, the terms, and to understand who you're incorporating in those terms. So can you give us a little overview of the words you're going to use today and who they encompass and what they actually mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I love this question. So this was actually one of the major motivating research questions of my book too, is how, what are the terms used to describe people at this time? And how can we actually know who is being talked about when we read archival documents that speak about particular categories that existed hundreds of years ago, right? So the most important category for me when tracing this movement was a term called Chino. Chino referring to someone who's gendered as male, and then China referring to someone who's gendered in colonial discourse as female. And so this is a word that's very curious, because in contemporary Spanish, Chino or China, Chinos, can refer to Chinese people of Chinese ethnicity. But something very strange happens when you have larger numbers of Asians arriving in the Americas and Mexico specifically. Chino comes to refer to anyone crossing the Pacific who's not European and who's not, in most cases, who's not of African descent as well, although there is some crossover. So who a Chino was, this is the first term that could actually encompass anyone vaguely identified as coming from coastal Asia. And that's everywhere from South Asia, the Bay of Bengal in particular, but then moving through Southeast Asia, the Philippines, what were called the Spice Islands of what's now Indonesia. You've got southern China through the port of Macau, and then the port of Nagasaki in Japan, from which Korean captives were also sent to the Philippines. So it's really this enormous convergence of people who get flattened in colonial language as Chinos during the early 17th century when they arrive in the Americas.
It's so fascinating hearing about that and the malleability of like categorical terms. I was actually really interested in initially when you were talking about where these folks came from, because my grandfather's actually from Malabar, and I was like, "Oh, you're kidding?" I was like, "Really?" I was like, "My people, like, tell me how we came here." And and even when you were talking about like, that flattening into this or that of the category of person, the first thing that came to my mind is actually sort of a modern conception of only recently have South Asians been considered Asian in North America. Right. It's like been a thing in Britain and the UK for forever. But they're in the last probably decade or so. South Asians are now slowly being considered a part of sort of like a pan-Asian identity here, which is wasn't the case before. But I just saw some modern parallels for it. And that was sort of my like first like, oh, this is a kind of curious. I'd like to hear more.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this was one of both the challenges and the inspiring sort of elements about writing the story, because it sits in the blind spot really of multiple fields. And I think what you've identified is a real challenge that emerged within the field of Asian American studies. Who gets to count as someone and who identifies as being part of this movement of this a political movement, but also a social movement that we call Asian America. That's something I also identify with personally, the kind of challenge of that category, because, I was born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee. I come from mixed parents, and my dad's Chinese Cuban. So, but the experience of growing up in the South as a mixed kid, like I never really felt part of the Asian American story, which I saw as like a real West Coast story, and that was totally not related to Latin America as well, even though like the histories are very much transnational, and then also not so much part of the Latino story either, because I saw that as being, my family members, for example, some of whom lived in Miami or who lived for a time in New York City. I saw that as being like a real, like those being like the major hubs of, Cuban diaspora, for example, in the U.S. So I saw myself as like kind of outside those categories. And I wanted to write this book to show how deeply entangled, the historical realities really were. You can't really just write a story about, the Chinese who are crossing the Pacific at this time, or the people from the Philippines, indigenous people from the Philippines who are crossing the Pacific, without also talking about all the other people who are on the ships with them, So it's a story that crosses multiple sort of, it's a multi-ethnic story is what I want to say. It's a story where you have people being identified as Asian in the Americas in particular ways, and also beginning to identify themselves using this language as well in ways that cut across ethnic groups too. And that also began to indicate particular kinds of interactions, not only among Asians, but also between Asians and indigenous people, and between Asians and Africans and Afro-descendants too. So, I mean, looking at cross-cultural exchange and interaction was a major piece of this to kind of get at, again, the blind spots of some of these categories.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you're watching this on YouTube, you may notice that you can see my face right now. We're excited to announce that we are releasing full episodes with video on our YouTube channel, Primary Source Media. So make sure you subscribe there if you'd like to see how confused I look most of the time, or see the log cabin that Lynn lives in. Anyway, back to the convo.
So before we get into, I have so many questions I can have from that. But what you're explaining sounds like a primary source nightmare, because if everyone's being called a Chino, you have no idea who the person really is. So tell us about the sources you used and how you figured out, you wanted individuals. You wanted to look at people, not statistics, not groups. So how did you get to that? Yeah, absolutely.
It's a complicated story, and I think what you just described as a primary source nightmare was my life for 7 years.
Oh, jeez.
But I mean, this is a real challenge with working with colonial archives, especially people who are most of the time sort of categorically written out of all of the standard narratives of this period, or who exist only at the peripheries of those narratives,
Right.
just outside of frame. So printed sources were a real challenge, and I had to move very quickly to the legal archive and notarial records where people actually show up because they existed in those places. And so I was looking at marriage records. I was looking at criminal cases. I was looking at Inquisition documents and legal sources of various kinds. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the major challenge is when you see someone identified as a Chino, it's like, okay, that actually doesn't communicate much of anything about who this person was, only about how they're being read and identified within a particular genre of colonial source, in a particular moment, because that person's categorization could actually even change over the course of their life too, for particular reasons. And so, but there are additional indicators that are present within these archival records that can give us a stronger sense about who these people were. So oftentimes you have words like de nación and then a more particular identifier. So you might have de nación Bengala, de nación Filipina, or de Manila, Chino de Manila, for example, to say someone is from Manila or from the Philippines or from the Bay of Bengal or what have you.
Sure.
So you have moments where those additional identifiers really become key for historians trying to place or recreate an individual's trajectory throughout this Pacific, Indian Ocean and Pacific world. And then there are some more specific indicators too, that especially come from Inquisition documents. So if a trial went to, if a denunciation went to a full trial, then that person had to give what was called a discurso de vida. So they had to tell the story of their life, basically, and talk about who their parents were and who their grandparents were and where they came from and what their religion was. And so through these kinds of trial records, there's a more full, again, legally constructed, but there's just more information in the archive that you can go on. And then just one final note, for example, in matrimonial records, you had to have witnesses for the marriage to be legal. So oftentimes folks, Asians who ended up in Mexico would choose other people that they crossed the Pacific with, or people that they knew in Manila, for example. So we could know that so-and-so knew so-and-so for 6 years in Manila, crossed on the same ship to get to Mexico and have known each other in Mexico City for the past 3 years, and had regular communication with them. And so you can start to get these sort of inklings of information that allow you to start to rebuild some of these networks, diasporic networks too.
And it sounds like you might have had some of their voices, probably not a lot, but maybe when they're telling their life stories, you get a little bit of an idea from their perspective.
Yeah, so there's a mediated first person that emerges through these documents. Sometimes it's a kind of summary of what they told the scribe who's recording all this information, and sometimes their first person voice is recorded, but it's not really a true first person in the sense that they didn't author the document, but didn't author their own accounts. It's being recorded in a legal setting, which means that we should take everything with a grain of salt and contextualize all of this. But it's, I think, even all of that being said, it is still remarkable how much information can be recovered from these kinds of sources.
That's fascinating. I can see why it took you 7 years. I'm surprised it took you only 7 years, I should say.
Yeah. I mean, there were archives in Spain, archives in Mexico, archives in the Philippines, not to mention in the U.S. as well. So yeah, it was a lot of travel too, which was great, but also a lot of work.
Yeah.
So just to give a little bit of context for our listeners, what time period are we talking about? Because most of the history that we talk about on the show has to do with, colonial era, revolutionary era, early American era, Atlantic history.
Right.
So this is actually a little bit of a step outside of that framework.
Yeah. So the time period follows the same time period as a shipping line that crossed the Pacific during this time, which was the primary route through which Asians arrived in the Americas during this period. And these ships were called the Manila galleons, and which is a bit of a misnomer because technically they left from a port just south of Manila called Cavite. And sometimes they weren't full galleons. Sometimes they were smaller ships too. But anyway, we call them the Manila galleons. And they crossed the Pacific from 1565 to 1815, right? So mid to late 16th century is when this story begins. This is really just like a couple generations after the first invasions of central Mexico by Spaniards, the sort of early beginnings of the foundation of colonial society. And is very much a site and a society that's in flux, actively changing. And that has a very prominent sort of an indigenous sector that's a majority of the population in most places in central Mexico, and at the same time a growing African and Afro-descendant population through the transatlantic slave trade. And during that early period, Mexico was actually the center of transatlantic slave trading. And so the time period extends through sort of the beginnings of independence and in the early 19th century. And the Manila galleons actually end because one of the major independence leaders in Mexico, Morelos, captures and burns the ports of Acapulco. And from then on, there are no more Manila galleons. So it takes us really through the majority of the colonial period.
Wow.
I don't know why that's a lot longer than I expected.
Yeah. I mean, it's 250 years. I like to say that there's more pre-19th century history of Asians in the Americas than post-19th century, although we tend to only think about 19th and 20th and then now 21st century, that period as being the period or the only period to study Asians in the Americas. But actually, there's 250 years of early modern history as well.
And this is a topic that, embarrassingly to say, it's very new to me. And so a lot of times as I was reading about it, I was like comparing it to the Atlantic world and trying to give myself, examples of, okay, this reminds me of this. And one question I have for you is, a lot of these people did not choose to, spend, was it 6 months on a ship to go to this new place? And how did they end up there? How were these people basically forced migrants? And then what was their trip like? Because it sounded horrific. I think that's another nightmare.
Yeah. No, I really like the question, and especially the comparison to the Atlantic world, because my training was actually in Atlantic world history. So many of the kinds of questions that I used to approach the Pacific, or the silences in the archives, or enslavement, and the difficulty with working with those kinds of sources, that comes from really like an Atlantic approach for me. We're working in many of the same archives, using many of the same kinds of documents. So I think there's a real way in which these fields are in active communication. Perhaps as many as 10,000 people were enslaved and shipped across the Pacific during this period. Perhaps half of the total number of Asians who ended up crossing the Pacific and landing in the Americas during this period. And you're right, even people who ostensibly did so as free migrants oftentimes didn't really have much of a choice in the matter either, right. Because the majority of them were sailors, and some of them were impressed as sailors, or if they sailed in one direction, they wouldn't be paid until they agreed to sail back in the other direction. So there's a lot of coercion present, even for those that we might call quote unquote free migrants, because they weren't explicitly enslaved.
Sure.
And desertion was always an issue on these ships, because if you sail across the Pacific and spend 6 months at sea without being able to stop and resupply at all, sort of exposed to the elements, then there's very little financial incentive that can actually motivate somebody to go and do it again.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people end up deserting in Mexico, and so that's also part of this channel of free migration, how people actually ended up staying in Mexico and not sailing back to the Philippines. But yeah, I mean, the journey itself, your description, I think, is apt. That it was simply horrific. I mean, it's hard to imagine. From the perspective of someone in the 21st century, the experience of being on a ship, an enclosed space that many contemporaries, during the early modern period described as prisons, for 6 months, and under, sort of the most abject conditions imaginable. These ships, and part of the reason for that is that these ships were primarily trade vessels. They were responsible for carrying silver from the Americas, sort of mined predominantly by enslaved indigenous people in places like Potosi, the Great Silver Mountain, or many of the other silver mines that are in Mexico. That's sent westward to the Philippines and traded to Chinese merchants. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Basically, Ming Dynasty China was changing its taxation system and from a paper currency to silver. And so now there's an enormous silver demand in China. So a lot of that silver being exported from the Americas actually ends up in China. And then in return, they're buying silks. Spaniards are buying silks. They're buying porcelain. They're buying lacquer. They're buying textiles from South Asia and from the Philippines, and sending it back in the other direction, because colonial elites in Mexico start to think of themselves as both at the center, really, of both the Atlantic and the Pacific, and see Mexico as being sort of the center of global markets. And so the hulls of the ships are filled with these trade goods, which means that people who are sailing the ships don't actually sleep beneath the deck. They sleep on the deck, or sort of shoved into these partially covered areas called the forecastle and the aftercastle, but that are still exposed on one side completely to the elements. And because the ships have to rise north to follow the currents to cross eastward from the Philippines to the Americas, they actually have to climb to a very high latitude, at or past northern Japan, in order to be able to cross east. And so they're exposed to winter-like conditions, and storms, and, there's never enough water and enough food, and people suffer from scurvy and other ailments, and still have to perform the enormous labor of keeping the ship afloat. And it's really, tremendous what that voyage consisted of. And as you might expect, the mortality rates were very high. Some ships lost most of their crews. And I mean, that's hundreds of people who were lost during these voyages. There's even one case during the 1650s of a ship that was so depleted. I think it spent like maybe 8 months at sea. It got caught up in storms and turned around, and there were all these issues. And by the time it's drifting past the coast of Mexico, it's like a ghost ship. There's hardly anybody left on board to even sail the thing, and it ends up crashing at a port in what's now Honduras. And so, I mean, that's not the only case of that kind of thing happening. And so it's this really horrific journey that's really Spain's only connection between its colonies in the Philippines and in Mexico. And so it's really an imperial periphery that's at the edge of ambition, because it represents so much to connect the Americas to Asia and have access to all these luxury goods and all that. But at the same time, sort of the amounts of influence and control that Spain can exert over this enormous space, the largest ocean in the world, is so minimal. And that's really a defining element of what the Pacific world was for, European colonial powers during the early modern period.
Good heavens. I feel like we can never complain about like a 20-hour plane ride.
Yeah,
Again.
I mean, actually, yeah, that's I
feel like
I oftentimes bring that up. When I'm talking to students about this, like, yeah, okay, flying to Asia now, like 16 hours, 20 hours. Yeah, it's pretty tough, but I mean, come on, 6 months, right? Like,
exactly. Look what these people went through. Forget it. Yeah. Nope. Never complain again. Nope.
Yeah.
6 months, no drink cart. It'd be terrible.
No drink card. Yeah. Honestly, like not even an airplane bathroom either.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's
devastating. I guess that makes sense, that the logistical challenges of exerting control is why, I guess, is that one of the reasons why this history isn't as emphasized in North America when we're talking about this time period? Because probably because America is a former British colony, that we tell that history a lot more, and versus the history of the Spanish Empire. But even then, I'm not sure I was ever exposed to, besides just cursory knowledge that the Philippines were in the hands of the Spanish Empire at one point, and there's a lot of Filipino and Spanish names because of that. Is that part of the reason that it was very it was theirs, but loosely controlled and limited interaction with actually the home country?
Yeah, to some extent. But I think part of this is more of a commentary on the nature of education in the U.S., really.
Sure.
And to a certain extent in Latin America as well, because it also has received somewhat less emphasis, albeit a little bit more, in the case of Mexico, for example. But I mean, part of it is the history of the Americas during the colonial period traditionally faces to the Atlantic for very good reasons. I mean, there's more connection to both West and West Central Africa as well as Western Europe. Across the Atlantic during this period, there's more movement of people, more trade, more sort of exchange of ideas, etc. The scale of slave trading across the Atlantic is enormous compared to the Trans-Pacific slave trade. So I think there's good reasons why the field has traditionally faced towards the Atlantic, but I think that one of the repercussions of that has been a kind of silencing or implicit silencing of the Pacific world. Even though the scale is smaller, it still had an enormous impact on sort of the daily rhythms of life in colonial society. I mean, from the U.S. perspective, part of this too is, what colonial history is oftentimes categorized as being, solely the British influence, right? And part of that is because of how the U.S. defined itself as a nation, as emerging from the sort of ruins of British colonialism. But, if we look at the actual reality of the continental U.S., like, how much of it was actually ruled by what was called the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which was Mexico, and then by independent Mexico afterwards.
Huge amount.
Basically everything west of the Mississippi. Like,
I'm in Los Angeles right now, so yeah.
Exactly. We're in old Mexico.
Right.
And then, you think about that, you think about Florida, and even, the Eastern Seaboard was regularly visited by Spanish expeditions as well. Like, it's impossible to think about these histories, in this sort of isolated way,
Right.
That's sort of restricted by how we define these categories of, early America, early U.S., and then colonial Latin American history, even the Atlantic world, Pacific world. I mean, I think these are all categories that can and should be destabilized. And I hope that my book, does that.
Absolutely. I've always been focused on the Atlantic world and then, of course, global history. And so I've heard of Pacific world, but, when I was reading your book, I was embarrassed by how little I knew. So I was, excited to learn it, but also horrified that I was just finally learning it.
And for those who don't know, Lynn does this professionally.
Yes. And, this is very new to me. And one of the things I'm fascinated about in history in general is identity. And actually, in our first season, our first episode, we asked, what does it mean to be an American? And so as these individuals are being brought over from different countries, I mean, they all have different identities. They're not just, Asian. They're not just Chino. And then, but they're brought over, and now all of a sudden they're in this world that is racializing them. Did they see themselves as racialized, or was that even a concept before they came over? And how did that work? I guess I'm getting way too philosophical. So try to ask a more specific question. How did they deal with that? How did their individuality as how they understood who they were change? And can you even answer that?
Yeah, that's a big question. And again, this is really one of the motivating questions that I was trying to access. Like, how did these people think about themselves? And especially because of the kind of damage that colonial racialized categories do and the difficulty of accessing that. I mean, that was my goal
Right.
in this research. And part of the difficulty of it too is just like the immense diversity of who Chinos were.
Right.
We've talked about ethno-linguistic group. There's a tremendous number of ethno-linguistic groups that are subsumed into the Chino category. And then, of course, you have social class as well.
Mm-hmm.
You have gender as well. On top of that, you have a wide range of skin colors, too, which also means something. You have Chinos who were categorized as white or described as white, and you have Chinos who are described as black, and everything in between. You also have Chinos, as we've talked about, who are enslaved, but you also have some cases of Chinos who become enslavers. And so for me, the people who are described as Chinos, they're really in this kind of in-between valley. That you have a group that are sort of approaching recognition, who are able to achieve some measure of social mobility, who are identified as Catholics, for example, very openly as Catholics, or at least who are able to perform Catholicism in a way that's recognized. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who, again, within the colonial mindset, represent sort of the greatest danger to colonial society, right? People who could not be trusted, who would, represent the threat of revolt, for example, and, were thought to need to be surveilled very closely, and this kind of thing. And so there's really nothing intrinsic to the Chino category that should indicate any kind of connection, really, whatsoever among people who are described as Chinos. But nonetheless, you see that kind of thing happening. And you see it happening first along the lines of ethno-linguistic group. So one of the best examples of that are people who come from the region called Pampanga, which is in the northernmost island in the Philippines, the island of Luzon. This is the same island where Manila is. And it's sort of in the area just to the north. and they're called Kapampangan people. And, they have their own language, culture and customs, etc. And they became renowned in the Philippines for being, very talented soldiers and sailors, and sort of being able to perform Catholicism in ways that Spaniards admired. And so that reputation and that kind of distinction does continue in many cases across the Pacific as well. People continue to identify themselves, again, not only as Chino, but Chino Pampango. So they're specifically Kapampangan, and they're able to petition for various kinds of rights because of that, and oftentimes because of their records of military service, for example, that other Chinos didn't have access to. And so we do have networks of Kapampangan people who lived in close relation. Perhaps they even married each other, or they were business associates in Mexico. The other thing that you have starting to happen too is that, as I mentioned earlier, Chinos refer to each other, that they knew each other for years in Manila, for example, or on the journey across the Pacific, even if they didn't share ethno-linguistic identities, that because they've had this experience together, that indicates new kinds of relations that are sort of unique products of trans-Pacific displacement in ways that cross ethno-linguistic groups. And then you have people who end up settling in the same places. One example is this town called Coyuca on the Pacific coast that the sort of long-term historical memory that shows up in a petition from the 18th century is that they were people who had arrived on the galleons and had abandoned the galleons and ended up settling in this place. Again, not all from the same ethno-linguistic group.
Right.
So there is a kind of transformation in how people think about themselves, who they choose to marry, who they choose as godparents as well, where they choose to settle, in ways that show new kinds of relations and that actually show preferences for other Chinos, regardless of ethno-linguistic group, even though they're an extreme minority within colonial society. There's way more Spaniards, indigenous people, Africans and Afro-descendants, and you do see connections with them as well, but with other Chinos at higher rates.
Well, that was a fantastic explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that was very in-depth. Now, was that sort of structure of society or where they were fitting in, was it ever formalized? Was there any legal status for them that was put upon them that was specific?
Yeah. So that's what Chino is. It's a legal designation as well. And Lynn, this actually gets back to the first part of your previous question, which is the differences between categorization in the Philippines versus Mexico.
Right.
Because most of these people in the Philippines were not called Chinos, unless they were actually, Chinese, identified as being Chinese from China.
Right.
And so the word that was used to describe most of the people who become Chinos is a term that was that refers to any indigenous vassal subject of Spanish Empire. So that means that they're people who are inhabitants of lands that were claimed by Spain during this period. And Spain claimed, in fact, a full half of the Earth's circumference. So that means a lot of people were considered indigenous vassal subjects.
Wow.
Right. And that indicates a particular kind of relationship to Spanish colonial society. It means that, especially during the early period, they're sort of vulnerable to enslavement. They have particular tribute obligations. There are again, certain labor obligations as well. And then all the kind of racializing things that we know and associate with colonial society. But it also meant, and this is in part because, the Spanish monarchs thought that their relationship to their vassal subjects should be, ideally a benevolent one. And this is sort of tied in to the rhetoric of Catholic charity and all of that. And so over the course of the 16th century, you have this kind of advocacy to end the enslavement of indigenous people in the Spanish Empire. It does get formalized through particular laws, but those laws are very haphazardly implemented. So you always have this sort of uneven relationship between laws being passed in Spain that are not always implemented in either the Americas or the Philippines. And so the category was Indio. These people are called Indios, and that indicates they're vassal subjects of the crown. And so there are at least some formal protections associated with that category, even if they were not always implemented. But upon arrival in the Americas and upon transformation into these Chino subjects, they're no longer Indios. You have this kind of intermediary category that exists for a while, and for some people, this Indio Chino. So they're Indio subjects, but they're also Chino, and that they're identified as coming from Asia, which differentiates them from people who are called Indios from the Americas, right?
It's a suit company that doesn't sponsor this podcast. Indochino, no? Right?
Oh, I didn't even think about that, but okay, yeah.
Call us. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're good. But yeah, so you have this kind of intermediary category, and then over time it becomes just predominantly Chino. And so what that means is, Indios could only be enslaved using particular exceptions to the rules of enslavement. Obviously, these exceptions are just abused to mostly enslave almost anybody. But by becoming Chinos, the exceptions no longer matter, or they hardly matter, unless the person who's called a Chino tries to identify again as an Indio and say that, well, I shouldn't actually be enslaved. And so you have this kind of contestation over the Chino category that occurs particularly as a form of advocacy for people who are enslaved. The other thing that it does is it makes Chinos vulnerable to inquisitorial denunciation. So formally, Indios are not supposed to be denounced to the Inquisition because they have a special exemption from the Pope for being sort of new converts to Catholicism. Never mind that most Asians were also new converts to Catholicism, but those dispensations did not really matter for people who were called Chinos. So they can now be denounced and tried by the Inquisition. There are also a set of laws that emerge that have to do with what we identify as the sistema de castas, or the caste system. There's various categories, not only Indio and Chino, but also categories associated with Afro-Mexicans like Negro and Mulatto that are part of this caste system. And basically what this refers to is that there's a series of laws that are implemented predominantly during the 17th century that are intended to control the kinds of activities that people pertaining to these castas can participate in. And that could be participating in particular kinds of trades, living in particular districts, being able to carry arms, for example, being able to sell certain kinds of products. And so those were also part of the restrictions that now apply to Chinos in colonial Mexico.
That's actually really interesting that those were all formal categories. I had no idea that those were illegal, because they persisted as descriptors over time, mostly.
Yeah.
Some derogatory, some not, but it's an interesting.
Right. So it exists like in discourse, and it also exists as a category in law. But I mean, the really complicated thing about its legal nature is it's constantly being contested, and then who actually counts as a Chino is so variable that this tremendous fluidity that's part of the category too, which makes it extremely hard to pin down as something that sort of practically affected people's lives on a regular basis. But what is clear upon consulting all these archival documents is that within formal legal settings, like, these descriptors did really matter.
So you mentioned the word emancipation. So was there a time when slavery just ended, or was it more sort of piecemeal? And I'm also curious if, so of course, from my Atlantic studies, there would be enslaved people who could purchase their freedom, run away. There were ways of escaping slavery besides emancipation. So was it a similar story in your research?
Yeah. Yes to all of that.
Nice.
So there's a wide range of practices that that Chinos participate in to contest the conditions of their enslavement. One of those tactics was running away. You have short-term flights, which is basically an act of protest, where an enslaved person would run away for a short period of time and then return on the hopes of receiving better treatment, which didn't always happen. I mean, sometimes, people were branded for running away.
Yeah, I can see it being risky.
And so, these are really, tactics of desperation, right? You also have long-term flights, which is, of a permanent nature or seeking to be of a permanent nature. And, this was a really complicated thing to put into practice. It requires having extensive social networks, not only in one's where one is living, but also outside of that place, to ensure that, you could run away and stay lost after running away, or that you have a knowledge of the landscape of a city or of an area to be able to effectively avoid people who would be looking for the enslaved. You also have other tactics like blasphemy. So during extreme punishment, denouncing God, Jesus, the Virgin Mary, the saints could be a tactic to potentially stop the punishment in the moment that it's happening. And the reason why this happens is because by denouncing God, it invokes the authority of the Inquisition. And so there would be a denunciation. The Inquisition would investigate what caused the enslaved person to blaspheme. And that could be an opportunity for that enslaved person to attest to the extreme ill treatment that they were receiving on the part of their enslavers. And this is really a problem for the Inquisition and for the enslaver, because one of the major justifications for enslavement was that the enslaver would provide a good model of Catholic faith for the enslaved. And if the treatment that the enslaver was giving the enslaved person so extreme that it violated that expectation of Catholic instruction, then in extreme cases, that would give the Inquisition grounds to order the enslaver to sell that enslaved person to a different enslaver. And, obviously it didn't work out that way in every case. Sometimes it only resulted in more punishment. But there were cases in which enslaved people were successful in arguing for sale to a different enslaver through blasphemy. And, obviously that's taking a chance too, because, you don't know who that other person is going to be, but perhaps, perhaps they might receive better treatment than their previous enslaver. And given.
Sure. Yeah, so we brought up the Inquisition a few times, and so what do people need to know about the Inquisition, like on a basic level, besides the fact that nobody expects it?
And that is certainly the first thing. The second thing is that, the Inquisition, it emerges in Spain. The Spanish version of the Inquisition emerges during the late 15th century. It's basically polices the bounds between what is accepted Catholic practice versus what is considered heretical or unorthodox practice. So it mostly polices the actions of recent converts, actually. Like, for example, in 1492, Jews are ordered to be expulsed from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spanish kingdoms, and those who stay are converted, at least formally, and become what are called conversos. And so the Inquisition polices the practices of conversos, ostensibly to try to ensure that they're not kind of backsliding into previous religious practices, Jewish practices. The same is true. It's true of Muslims who are forced to convert as well, who are called moriscos. And so you have this kind of this perpetual fear of religious or spiritual backsliding that really defines the Inquisition and its actions vis-a-vis colonized populations in the Americas as well. I mean, it also goes after Spaniards and other Europeans who are, because, there's a wide range of sort of folk or spiritual practices that are present in Spain too, that are not strictly Catholic and that also get transplanted to the Americas. So basically anyone who is not practicing Catholicism in a kind of strictly Orthodox way is could be vulnerable to denunciation.
And did that legal framework of sort of the Catholic behavior and how you should be run parallel to the actual legal system, or was it intertwined with, here's the code of laws, and then, but you also have to be a good Catholic, and then these are the guys that police that stuff, or were they sort of melded together?
Yeah, I mean, so the interesting thing about the Inquisition is it does have its guidelines, but there are so many edge cases of something that, one inquisitor could view it as a forgivable offense. One of those that comes up a lot is just cursing aloud, right? Like you was saying something like, "Ah, God damn it!" We're
gonna bleep that in the final recording, so no one will know what you said.
that's fine, right?
I'm kidding.
You could be denounced for that.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
Cursing aloud.
Yeah.
But then another inquisitor would be like, "We don't have time to persecute that. What are you talking about? That happens all the time." And you have other cases of people. This one is slightly more serious, but it depends. It's people saying "Oh, simple fornication is not a sin," right?
Okay.
Well, for the Inquisition, that's a very controversial statement to make.
Right.
But so anyway, you have. I mean, that's why these trials are so long. I mean, oftentimes they take years to resolve.
Oh my goodness.
And while the person is on trial, they're in prison.
Oh my God.
This is actual imprisonment without knowing the verdict of the trial. That could last years, and the person was responsible for paying the cost of their own imprisonment during that time too. Pretty rough. But the Inquisition is constantly overstretched, both in the Americas and in the Philippines. I mean, the Holy Office that's based in Mexico City also has to oversee inquisitorial cases in the Philippines too. And so what is considered actually a punishable offense, something that's worth actual time and resources to figure out, is highly dependent on who the inquisitors actually overseeing the trial were.
That's really interesting.
So I think since your interest is in individual stories or more about the human aspect, is there any sort of individual or any story that sort of was your favorite or stood out to you in all of your research? I know you start your book with a fantastic story, so I don't know if you want to talk about her or if there's something else that sort of just sticks in your memory as something that maybe changed you or just has some kind of emotional connection.
Yeah. I do want to talk about that one person that I start the book with. So her name was Catarina de San Juan. That was her baptized name. She's from South Asia. We don't know exactly where from the sources. She's captured and enslaved as a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She's captured on a beach. and over the next couple of years, eventually sold to Spaniards in the Philippines, like many South Asians of the time, and from there sold across the Pacific to Mexico. Eventually she gains her freedom because her enslaver dies. And it wasn't entirely uncommon during this period that an enslaver might free a kind of privileged enslaved person or a kind of prized enslaved person upon death, because they thought of it as like a very holy act. It'll sort of grease the wheels to getting into heaven by performing this kind of benevolent act upon death. Sure. I guess God wasn't asking whether or not why they didn't do that sooner. But, but anyway, this was the case for Catarina, and she gains renown as this sort of devotional icon, and actually becomes one of the most famous figures of the colonial period in Mexico. And the accounts written about her, and one in particular by her Jesuit confessor, is the longest text or biographical text to be published in colonial Mexico. It's really this remarkable thing.
Wow.
It's 3 volumes. It's published over the course of 3 years, and it's enormous. And it's so much more remarkable because of the rarity of having published material about someone who was enslaved, not to mention a woman who was enslaved, and a South Asian woman at that. And so she sort of has this kind of there's this mythic quality to her life because of that. And because sort of the Jesuits who admired her in the city of Puebla in Mexico thought of her as a kind of model Catholic. And sort of that's their investment in her story, the idea that, she could show the global success of the Catholic mission, because, someone who comes from such a distant place like Catarina could still become, a model Catholic figure. But there are many signs in the accounts about her life that the story of her life and what she believes is actually like a lot more complicated than that, perhaps propagandistic story about her. And one of the things that really stands out to me in the narrative is she says, she has all these spiritual visions, which is part of the reason why her publications are suppressed after her life. And one of the reasons why sort of details about her actual life get forgotten over time or sort of become folkloric in a way. But one of the things that she says that she sees the most in her visions is actually her parents arriving in Mexico from across the Pacific. They land in the port of Acapulco, they disembark from the galleons, and they come on their knees into her presence. And she sees that they're in purgatory and all this. So there's, religious overtones to this scene that she describes. But to me, what better articulation is there of that experience of displacement as a child across the Pacific, conjuring a world in which one can be with one's parents again, or envisioning a homeland that's been lost. And I think that there's so much that's resonant to that story and other stories that are part of Catarina's life that can actually help us understand the silences that are present in the documentation about the lives of other Asian people who end up in the Americas during this period. So I mean, her story is the kind of current that runs throughout the book, because it's just so remarkable that there's actual narrative information about her life. And she experiences enslavement, experiences freedom. Returning to Lynn's earlier question, there is a moment of emancipation for enslaved Chinos in 1672. But like many emancipation orders of its time, it fails to universally eliminate the enslavement of Asian people. Right. And, that enslavement persists for another 3 or 4 decades. And then sort of even Asians are still imagined as enslavable or people associated with enslavement even long after that.
That's right.
In Mexico. And so Catarina's life is actually indicative of some of that, because those who wrote about her, and those publications occur after the emancipation of Chinos, they said that her enslavement was, even though they describe it as this horrendous thing that happened to her, that it was still better to be enslaved and then brought into the Catholic world than not to be enslaved and not to be a Catholic. So even though Catarina, ends her life as a free woman, she's been free for like 6 decades by the time she finally passes away. And Chinos were no longer supposed to be enslaved. Still, her life, the enslavement that she experienced was considered justified because she became Catholic as a result of it.
That's beautiful. I mean, I'm glad that your book is bringing her back. And I'm hoping a lot of people will look more into her now that they know who she is.
Yeah. I mean, one of the really sort of fulfilling things about publishing the book and, doing some other public historical writing that's related to the content of the book is there has been a lot of interest about the life of Catarina de San Juan. That's one of the stories, I'm really happy to share with people who might feel, personally connected to her life.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that is a wonderful place to end our conversation, because we were just about at time. But if you've enjoyed anything we've talked about, please, if you're listening, please go check out the book First Asians in America: A Trans-Pacific History. And for our audience who wants to follow along with your work, if you're watching on YouTube, go subscribe to the YouTube, because Lynn is holding up the cover, so you'll be able to recognize it when you see it on the shelf or when you're perusing your preferred online book proprietor. So for our listeners who want to follow along with your work, do you publish things? Do you have a blog? Do you publish things on social media? Is there any way that they can keep up with what you're up to?
So I've been publishing with The Conversation over the past months. I've had 3 articles there. I published recently in Aeon magazine and Smithsonian Folklife, parts of these stories as well.
Cool.
I would say just stay up to date with my faculty profile, and you'll get some of the updates as they come out.
There you go, and we'll set up instructions for putting a Google alert on your own Google thing, so you'll know when things are published.
Yes. The other thing that I'll just mention quickly is part of this public historical work I'm doing around the book actually includes a podcast as well.
Oh, great!
And it's a podcast that seeks to tell the story behind the book. In other words, how one's personal experiences can actually be very influential in how one approaches these histories. And so that's a podcast that will probably be coming out in around May or June with a couple of close collaborators that I'm excited to be working with. So stay tuned for more information on that.
Oh, that's a fascinating topic. I will absolutely be listening to that.
Yeah, we'll make sure we share the link on our socials.
All right, well, thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us, Diego. That was an awesome conversation.
Thank you
for having me.